My friend, picture a gym in Boston, October 12, 1979. The lights are bright. The crowd is loud, but not for the reason you think. A man named Chris Ford is standing well behind a painted line nobody has ever had to respect before. He lets the ball go. It drops through the net. And in that one quiet second, the sport of basketball changes forever. Can you feel it? That single shot is about to rewrite everything. Nobody in that arena knew it yet. The scoreboard just read 3 points instead of 2. No fireworks. No slow-motion replay. Just a number. But numbers have a way of hiding revolutions inside them, don't they? Let's go back further. Because to understand why that shot mattered, you have to understand the sickness it was curing. By the late 1960s, professional basketball had a problem. The game had become a wrestling match disguised as a sport. Big men would plant themselves under the basket, backs to the rim, elbows out, daring anyone to move them. Guards would dribble the air out of the ball, waiting, stalling, running the clock down to nothing. Fans paid to see speed and soul. What they got some nights was 2 teams standing still, circling each other like they were afraid to commit to anything. Sports writers called it boring. Attendance dipped in cities that once roared. Television executives, still new to the idea of broadcasting live sports into people's living rooms, worried out loud that basketball simply wasn't built for the screen. Too slow, too repetitive, too easy to look away from. Picture it for a second. A packed arena on a Tuesday night, half the seats empty by the 4th quarter. A father bringing his son to his first game, promising him it would be electric, and watching that same boy start checking the clock by halftime. That was happening more often than anyone in the league office wanted to admit. You know that feeling, don't you? When something you love starts to feel like a chore. When the thing that used to make your heart race becomes something you can predict from the opening tip. That's what basketball had become for a lot of people watching from the stands. Enter a new league. Loud, scrappy, hungry to be taken seriously. The American Basketball Association launched in 1967, and it had almost nothing to lose. No history to protect. No sacred rules to defend. Just a red, white, and blue ball that looked like it belonged on a carnival midway. A slam dunk contest nobody had ever thought to hold before, and a desperate need to feel different enough from its older, more respected rival to survive. A man named Bill Sharman, who would later become the league's commissioner, believed the game needed more than just talent on the floor. He believed it needed risk. Reward. A reason for a shooter 40 feet from the rim to let it fly instead of passing it back inside to a crowded, tangled paint. So the ABA did something the NBA had never dared to try. It drew a new line on the floor, farther out than anyone had shot from with any real intention, and declared that any shot made from behind it would count for 3 points instead of 2. 3 points. Not 2. A single word, 3. That would eventually turn quiet role players into legends and reshape how an entire sport was played, coached, and even dreamed about by kids who hadn't been born yet. But here's the open loop, my friend, the thread I want you to hold onto tightly. Because while the ABA was busy turning this rule into a nightly spectacle on the other side of the country, in a small Indiana gym that nobody was filming, a skinny kid was shooting from that same kind of distance for fun with no line drawn at all just because it felt right leaving his hands. Keep that image close. We'll come back to him, and when we do, you'll understand exactly why he matters. At first, most people did not take the 3-point shot seriously. Traditionalists in the basketball world sneered at it. They called it a gimmick, a carnival trick for a league that couldn't compete on fundamentals, so it had to compete on flash and noise instead. The NBA, the older, more established league, wanted nothing to do with it. Real basketball, they insisted, was played inside. Real basketball was about the block, the post, the 2-point jumper taken with your feet set and your form textbook clean. Why would you reward a wild, low-percentage heave from that far away with more points, just because it happened to go in? Because harder things deserve to matter more, don't they? Isn't that true somewhere in your own life too? The thing you attempted that everyone else considered too risky to try? The ABA leaned into the rule anyway. Players who had once been dismissed as undersized or one-dimensional, or simply not built for a 2-point world, suddenly had a new way to be dangerous on any given night. Fans started coming to games specifically to see it happen. A man letting one go from 30 feet, the crowd rising to its feet before the ball had even finished its arc, because they already knew, they could feel it in the air, the way you feel a storm coming before the first drop of rain. That shared held breath became the league's signature. It became the reason people who had given up on the sport started paying attention again. Meanwhile, the NBA kept its distance. Through the late 60s, through the 70s, year after year, while the older league debated, quietly and then loudly, whether the three-point shot belonged to basketball at all, or whether it was simply theater wearing an athlete's uniform. The struggle wasn't really about a single rule. It was about identity. What kind of game did basketball want to be? Cautious and controlled, the way it had always been, or bold, unpredictable, willing to reward the shot that could break a game open in a single possession. In 1976, the two leagues finally merged, the ABA folding into the NBA, four of its teams surviving the transition into the bigger, older league. But the three-point line did not come with them. Not yet. It was left behind at the door, like an idea whose time still hadn't fully arrived. Can you imagine building something that revolutionary, watching it electrify crowds for nearly a decade, and then watching it get quietly shelved the moment you finally earn a seat at the bigger table? Some of the very players who had thrived under that rule now found themselves in a league that refused to use it. Shooters who had built entire reputations on their range suddenly had to retrain themselves, had to pull that same shot back inside the arc, had to pretend, for a few more seasons, that the tool they had mastered simply didn't exist anymore. Imagine spending years perfecting something, only to be told to set it aside because the room you just walked into hasn't caught up yet. For 3 more years, NBA games were played without it. The stalling problem hadn't gone away on its own. Scoring in some seasons had grown so predictable, so mechanical, that fans and executives alike were nervous about the sport's future. Television ratings mattered more than ever by 1979, and a slow, grinding, two-point-only product was a difficult thing to sell to a country that increasingly wanted highlights, energy, and moments worth replaying, not homework disguised as entertainment. So in the spring of 1979, the NBA's Board of Governors finally voted to adopt the three-point line for the upcoming season, on what was meant to be nothing more than a 1-year trial. Just an experiment. A concession, really, to a rule the older league had resisted for over a decade. Nobody promised it would stay past that first season. Nobody in that boardroom knew, walking into the fall, that they were about to permanently alter the DNA of the sport they were trying to protect. Which brings us back to that gym in Boston. October 12, 1979. Opening night of the new season. The Boston Celtics against the Houston Rockets. A forward named Chris Ford, not a superstar, not a household name, just a steady professional doing his job on a Friday night, catches the ball above the newly painted arc. He doesn't hesitate. He shoots. It goes in. The first three-point field goal in NBA history, scored by a role player, on the very first night the rule officially existed. Not by a legend chasing a headline. Not by design or ceremony. Just by a man in the right place, willing to take the shot that a decade of debate had spent calling unnecessary. Isn't it strange how history so often arrives quietly, in the hands of someone nobody expected to be holding it? That first season, the three-point shot was treated the way any new, untrusted tool is treated. Coaches barely used it. Most teams attempted only a handful of three-pointers across an entire game. Some nights, entire rosters would go without taking a single one, as if the line simply didn't exist for them, an invisible boundary they had agreed among themselves to ignore. The two-point mid-range jumper still ruled the sport. The low-post fadeaway still ruled the sport. This new rule sat on the very edge of the game, tolerated the way you tolerate a stranger at a family dinner, but not yet welcomed, not yet believed in. Do you know what it usually takes for people to trust something new? Most of the time, it takes one person brilliant enough and stubborn enough to make it undeniable. Remember that kid in the small Indiana gym, shooting from deep with no line at all just because it felt right? His name was Larry Bird, and by the mid-1980s, he was doing on NBA floors what he had once done alone in the dark, hour after hour, with nobody keeping score but himself. He didn't just make threes. He made them feel inevitable, the way a sunset feels inevitable once the sky starts to change color. In 1986, the NBA introduced an official three-point shooting contest during its All-Star weekend, and Bird walked into that competition and, according to several of the players who were there, calmly asked the room which one of them was playing for second place. He then won the very first contest. He won it again in 1987, and again in 1988. 3 years running, the same message delivered every single time. This shot is not a gimmick. This shot is a weapon, and I am not afraid to use it. That's the loop closing, my friend. The kid nobody was filming became the man who made the entire sport start watching. Slowly, painfully slowly, the game began to bend around what Bird and a handful of other sharpshooters were proving possible. Players like Dale Ellis, who built a reputation as one of the league's most dangerous perimeter scorers of the era, showed that a career could be built out beyond the arc rather than in spite of it. If one man could turn a low-percentage gimmick shot into a devastating, game-deciding weapon, what could an entire era of players do with it, once they stopped fearing the failure that came with missing from so far away? The answer took time. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the three-point shot grew steadily but cautiously, still treated as a complement to the game rather than its foundation. Teams still built around dominant big men in the post. Centers were still the highest-paid, most coveted pieces on any championship roster. The three-pointer was a spice you sprinkled onto a system, not yet the main ingredient of the meal. But cracks kept appearing in the old resistance. A guard named Reggie Miller made himself into one of the most feared closers in the league by treating the three-point line as his home address, sending crowds in Madison Square Garden into stunned silence more than once with shots that seemed to defy the rhythm of the game around him. He'd catch the ball, feet already set from years of repetition, and let it go before defenders had even finished closing out, a half-second advantage built entirely on trusting a shot that an earlier generation of coaches would have benched him for even attempting. And a forward named Dennis Scott set single-season three-point records of his own, proof stacking on top of proof that this wasn't a fluke, this wasn't a phase, this was simply where the sport was slowly, inevitably heading. By the middle of the 1990s, it had become difficult to imagine a closing lineup in a close game without at least one player the defense had to respect from 30 feet out. The shot that had once been benched, mocked, and shelved was now something opposing coaches game-planned around at 2 in the morning, sketching X's and O's specifically to keep one man away from a piece of hardwood he had made his own. Then came the turning of a new century, and with it, a quieter, less flashy revolution, built not on legs and lungs, but on numbers. Front offices started hiring analysts who looked at the geometry of the court differently than any coach before them ever had. They noticed something almost embarrassingly simple, something that had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. A shot worth 3 points only needed to go in a little more than two-thirds as often as a two-point shot to be worth exactly the same mathematically on average over the course of a season. And in the mid-range, that awkward, in-between zone that used to define what people called a fundamentally sound offense, shots were going in at rates barely better than that. The math had been staring everyone in the face for decades. It just took long enough and enough failed resistance for people to finally trust it. Teams like the Houston Rockets, under an executive named Daryl Morey, started reshaping their entire offensive philosophy around this idea. Fewer mid-range shots. More shots at the rim and more shots from behind the arc, cutting out the least efficient part of the floor almost entirely. Critics called it soulless. They called it Morey ball, said with the same sneer that traditionalists once used against the ABA 30 years earlier. Talking heads on television debated whether basketball was losing something irreplaceable, some artistry in the mid-range game, some toughness in the post, being traded away for a spreadsheet's idea of efficiency. Do you see the pattern forming here, my friend? The same fight, dressed in a different uniform, fought all over again by a new generation who thought they were arguing about something brand new, never realizing they were simply repeating a conversation the sport had already had and already settled once before. And then, into all of this walked a player who didn't just accept the three-point shot as a useful tool. He made it feel like breathing. Stephen Curry entered the league in 2009, undersized by most measures, doubted by scouts who preferred bigger, more traditionally built guards with a more conventional game. Some questioned whether his slight frame could even survive the physical toll of an 82-game season, let alone reshape it. But Curry shot from distances that made grown professionals shake their heads on the bench in disbelief, and he made them at a rate nobody had ever sustained before over a full season. In the 2015 to 2016 season, he made 402 three-pointers, a single-season record that didn't just break the previous mark. It shattered it by an entire tier beyond what anyone had thought possible, night after night, arena after arena, until opposing crowds started cheering for him even when he was wearing the wrong jersey. Because of him, and because of the era he helped build around himself, the modern game looks almost unrecognizable compared to that hesitant first season back in 1979. Teams now regularly attempt 3 or 4 times as many three-pointers per game as they did just a couple of decades earlier. Young players in driveways and school gyms all over the world don't dream about the mid-range jumper anymore. They dream about pulling up from 30 feet, the way Bird once did in an empty Indiana gym with nobody watching, the way Curry does now in front of millions, phones raised, ready to capture the moment before it even happens. And the ripple didn't stay contained to one league or even one country. Once the rule proved itself in the NBA, other levels of the sport followed, some quickly, some dragging their feet the same way the NBA once had. College basketball in the United States adopted its own version of the arc in the mid-1980s, shorter than the professional distance at first, giving a new generation of young shooters a place to grow into the weapon before they ever turned professional. International basketball, governed by its own set of rules under FIBA, brought in a three-point line of its own not long after, spreading the same idea across continents, into gyms in Spain and Lithuania and the Philippines and Argentina, places that would one day send their own sharpshooters into the NBA, having grown up with the arc as simply a normal part of the floor, never having known a version of the sport without it. The WNBA, when it launched in 1997, built the three-point shot into its foundation from the very beginning, never even needing to have the argument that had taken the men's professional game more than a decade to resolve. Women like Diana Taurasi and Sue Bird, and later a wave of sharpshooters who grew up idolizing them, treated the line not as a controversial gimmick but simply as one more tool in a full and complete offensive arsenal, proof that once a rule earns its place, later generations rarely remember there was ever a fight about it at all. Think about what that means, my friend. An entire generation of players around the world grew up never knowing basketball without this shot, the same way you might never remember a world without the phone in your pocket, even though someone somewhere once had to fight to convince a skeptical room that it was worth building at all. Every convenience you take for granted today was once somebody's uphill argument. Coaches change too, and maybe this is the quieter part of the story, the part that doesn't make the highlight reels but matters just as much. Practice gyms that once spent entire sessions drilling post-up footwork and mid-range form began carving out equal time, then more than equal time for catch-and-shoot repetitions from behind the arc youth coaches, the ones shaping 8 and 9 and 10-year-olds long before any scout ever watches them play, started teaching the three-point shot early, correcting form around it, building entire offensive systems designed to create just one more open look from just a few extra feet away. A rule that had once been dismissed as reckless had become, within 2 generations, one of the very first things a young player is taught to value. Think about that whole arc for a moment, my friend, start to finish. A rule mocked as a gimmick by one struggling league, trying desperately to survive. Ignored by a more established league for over a decade out of pure stubbornness. Adopted reluctantly, almost apologetically, as a one-year trial nobody expected to last. And now, it is the beating heart of how the entire sport is played, coached, broadcast, and even dreamed about, from packed NBA arenas all the way down to a kid shooting alone after school with nobody keeping score but themselves. Here is what I want you to sit with. Chris Ford didn't know he was making history when he let that ball go in Boston. He wasn't chasing a legacy that night. He was just doing his job, taking the open shot, trusting a rule that most of the league around him still quietly doubted. And Larry Bird, alone in that Indiana gym as a kid, wasn't practicing to change basketball forever either. He was just shooting because it felt right in his hands, long before anyone told him it would ever matter to anyone but him. Isn't that how most real change actually happens? Not with a grand plan announced to the world. Not with certainty or applause or anyone watching. Just with someone, in a quiet moment nobody is filming, willing to take the shot that everyone else has already decided isn't worth the risk. Think of everyone who had to be wrong or at least hesitant along the way. The traditionalists who called it a gimmick. The NBA executives who left it behind for a decade after the merger. The coaches who barely used it in that first tentative season. None of them were foolish. They were simply standing where most of us stand most of the time, protecting the version of the game or the version of life that had always worked well enough before. It takes something rare to look at that comfortable, familiar version of things and ask whether it could be more. So the next time you're standing at the edge of something in your own life, some idea, some choice, some version of yourself that feels too far outside the accepted line, remember that gym in Boston, October 12, 1979. Remember a rule that was mocked, delayed, and doubted for over a decade before it reshaped an entire sport from the ground up. Remember a kid in Indiana, shooting alone in the dark with nobody watching, who grew up to prove an entire league wrong simply by doing, in public, what had always felt natural to him in private. The distance that once seemed reckless can become the exact thing the world eventually builds itself around. All it takes, my friend, is someone willing to let go from further out than everyone else believed was worth trying.